Start a little bit earlier. Thank you very much for having us here. My name is Daniela Kuzu. I'm the Deputy Director of FES Turkey. We are very happy to be here, and I'm very happy to chair the first session of this conference. It was a little bit a sad arrival, I have to say. We were standing at the airport yesterday morning. Actually, 8 of us. Then we heard the news about Ankara. To be honest, most of the participants, the Turkish participants, thought of coming here. One actually dropped out. He checked in already. But then he said, I would like to go to Ankara because some of his students, colleagues, have organized a demonstration, and he didn't know what was going on. Some of the people he called, they were crying on the phone, so he decided to move to Ankara. I think that was a very wise decision, and I thank a lot the Turkish participants who actually came here under these difficult circumstances. At the moment, the news said that there are 97 dead, and it varies. The reports vary. It's like 200 to 400 are injured. So it's actually very difficult. So thank you very much for the Turkish participants that they're actually here, and also to Matt, who is also working for FES Turkey, who organized the whole event with FES Israel. Thank you so much. I would like to say something about myself very briefly before I come to the presenters. I'm working for the FES now for 10 years. 5.5 years I have been posted to Ghana. West Africa was responsible for economic transformation. I actually headed the office, but I specialize in economic transformation in the informal sector. So I have some knowledge about the economy. African economies are quite difficult. There's a massive privatization of public services as well, and little control by the state. It lacks competition a lot. There's massive corruption. So it was also a difficult time. So I'm very happy to be here to actually hear something about the comparison Turkish and Israeli privatization. I'm in Istanbul now since May, so I'm very fresh. But my Turkish is quite sufficient. Biraz Türkçe konuşuyorum. My husband is Turkish, so I just know about Turkey a lot since a couple of years. So this panel now is actually an introduction of this conference. It's an historical overview about both cases, Turkey and Israel. And I would like to basically tell you beforehand, we have 20 minutes, 25 minutes of presentations. I will make sure, as German as I am, that we stick to the time, and so that we have more room for discussions and questions, etc. I would like to introduce the speakers now. We start with, I hope I pronounce your name correctly, Michel Strawczynski. Professor Michel Strawczynski, who is the head of the Economic and Society program at the LeerJerusalem Institute. I guess most of you will know him. And he's also at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and the former deputy head of the research division of the Bank of Israel, which is quite interesting. So he would like to give a presentation on Israel economy, evolution, and Selfie. And next to me is the lovely Dr. Yelda Yücel. She works for the Department of Business Administration at the Istanbul Bilgi University, a very famous one. And she will give a presentation on some observations on gendered impacts of post-2000 economic transformation in Turkey. So I don't want to steal any more time of the presentation, so we would like to start with Michel.
So thanks again to our guests for coming here after these sad events. I was asked to present the Israeli economy, a kind of selfie, the situation today, and how did we get there. From an historical perspective, the evolution, when Israel shall be mentioned as a case, that if I have to choose a phrase, I would say from government intervention to market economy. We used to have an economy where the government was the major player, and as time goes by, the economy more and more is being, the allocation of resources is being done by the market, and this policy is run by different governments that we had, and we see in the last decade, we see an increase of this direction. I will show you some of the main variables as a kind of broad picture before we start with the topic of privatization. So this policy in general, when people talk about Israel, is considered as a relatively success. When we look at the GDP per capita, we know today we like to measure the quality of life. That would be the right thing to do. But today I am showing you the GDP per capita, where we stand at a 22nd position among OECD countries, in a place which is similar to the one of Spain, New Zealand, not far from Italy. If I go a little bit to the other side, South Korea, which is a well-known Asian tiger. So, and if we look, for example, at what happened after the crisis, the huge economic crisis in 2009, Israel is considered a country that went through at those times. So in general, it is told as a story of success when you look at the macroeconomic performance. We have completely ended inflation that happened even at the beginning of the 2000s. So we look quite as a developed economy in those terms. But when we look at the other side of the coin, what we find immediately is that we are paying a kind of price, a clear price, which comes about in this graph very clearly when we look at the poverty after taxes and transfers, where we have one of the last positions. In this specific graph, we are only the single country that is behind us is Mexico, and as Werner mentioned before, US is also in this area. And clearly, there is a huge challenge, but the problem is that that's not only the challenge, the problem is that it is completely related to the process that we had before. So that process may be very good in some terms, but the other side of the coin is that it may become very bad in other terms. So I will mention some of the things. I will not have enough time to get deeper into the issues, but since this is a kind of introductory dissertation, I would like to mention some of the issues. Let me first start, given that this is something that is similar to Turkey and Israel, I mean, having a relatively high rate of poverty, let me start first with the main problem. We know that what is particular about Israel and Turkey, and I would also say Mexico, as you saw, they are also with that problem, is that we have this is a young country, a country where people have many children, and this is a huge challenge, completely different to what we see in developed economies. So I ask here the question, is it possible to have a high income and a low poverty rate, like we see in Norway, we see in Denmark, we see at the average OECD, but we do not see it in Turkey and Israel. And the main problem is that both countries are characterized by a high percentage of families with more than 3 children. And we know that all developed economies, they have relatively old population, and they are facing health expenditure because of the kind of pyramid that they have, the population pyramid that they have, while Israel and Turkey, they are a slightly different case with young population, which it implies a huge challenge. So you can see it in this graph. Both Israel and Turkey are examples of societies with a very high number of children. So is it possible to have a high income and low poverty rate? If you are in a society with smaller families, it looks like it's easier, because once you have a huge family, then by definition, when you measure poverty, you are in poverty. If you have 8, 7, 6 children, by definition, when you look at the numbers, you are a poor family. And even if there are 2 earners that earn a lot of money, it will become difficult for them to be out of poverty. But if those earners have a high wage, that's possible. But this is a huge challenge. The problem, is that we have big families, but the problem in Israel is that these big families also belong to weak sectors. And those sectors are relatively identified in Israel. And they have low participation in the high-tech industries, that those are the ones that lead the growth in Israel. They have low participation at universities. And they are identified in Israel. We are talking mainly about 2 groups, the Arab population that is around 20% of the population, and the ultra-Orthodox population that is today around 10% of the population, and both of them will become 50% in the next 40 years. So those populations have a huge rates of poverty, and they have relatively low participation at universities, low participation in high-tech. So we have, from one side, we have relatively successful story of growing economy led by high-tech sector, but on the other side, not all these sectors participate on this growth. So the huge challenge that we have here in Israel is to look ahead and increase the participation of those populations at growth-enhancing industries. But as an introductory story, I have to start before coming at the end of my dissertation back to the problem. I have to ask the question, how did we get there? And this was a very long evolution toward market allocation. We used to have a huge government, although the government was mainly involved in defense expenditure, but it was also involved in many other fields that will come about through the discussions today and tomorrow. But clearly, the government went into the market allocation that are very clear when we talk about the financial sector, but they are more and more tangible when we look at what happens in the last 10 years. So let's start with the historical history. We saw a financial liberalization. I am showing you the financial liberalization through the foreign direct investment. This is usually done because it's a kind of summary number. When you open your economy, you allow the market to have some market allocation. Then you open it, you liberalize, and you allowed foreign investment to come to Israel. That was also related to the portfolio in general, also for short-term capital movements. But I'm showing you here something that is considered a kind of related to the heart of the economy, because many of this foreign direct investment goes to those growing industries that I was talking about. So some of them go to, to the energy sector, but some of them also go to even high-tech. Okay, so you see many foreign coming and investing in Israel. And what you see here is that from numbers of 0.1% of GDP in the 80s, a jump in the decade of globalization, because 90s is the decade of globalization. We have a jump to 2%, and then a huge jump to 7%. So that, by all means, looks very high, but in order to allow you to understand the degree, let me show you the numbers at the world level. And when we look at the world level, we see the developed economies, we see the developing emerging countries, and the average. And what we see is that the jump in the 90s, it happened everywhere. So we see, for example, if I look at the median of all countries, from 0.6, I look here, from 0.6 to 1.86, which looks similar to what happened in other countries. But then we see a jump to 3% of GDP, while I remind you the number in Israel that was 7% of GDP. So this is some kind of summarizing the huge increase of opening the economy, allowing market allocation, which of course, this is only a summary number, and you will see in a minute the straight tools that were used by the government in order to get there. So one of them was the transition to flexible exchange rate. We used to have a fixed exchange rate, and the government was wanting to tell people, this is not a government economy, a government-managed economy. This is a free market allocation, so we'll go for a flexible exchange rate. And that happened, as you see in this graph, that happened in many countries. That was not only in Israel. That transition happened everywhere. But in Israel, it was many years ago. We used to have some managed exchange rate, some system with a band, and that was completely abandoned at all in 2005 for good. So it's quite clear that Israel will not get there. Every governor that gets to the Bank of Israel continues and says that that's the end. It will not come back. So this is a clear tool of market allocation. Sometimes in many countries, this is being used by the government, showing some government responsibility for the exports, which clearly is one of the fields that are important for the country. In Israel, that responsibility continues because the Bank of Israel buys foreign exchange. So this is not a place where the government completely abandoned, but this policy is discussed. The Bank of Israel is leading it, but there is a huge discussion concerning this policy. And getting more closer to my story, which is a story about the GDP and the goods, we shall look at the goods liberalization and mention the custom duty reduction that happened in the 90s, quite at the beginning of globalization. So Israel was clearly telling, the government of Israel was clearly telling industries, you should go for comparative advantage. You should know that building here textile industries, when you have to compete with China or India or other countries that have much cheaper personnel, you will be wrong. So in order to tell it to you very clearly, I am reducing the custom duties, which were 1.2% of GDP in the 80s and became 0.3 in the 90s. The huge reduction was clear in textile, in cosmetics, in leather, clothing, and later in electric devices. Those of you that remember the process, those were the last ones. Still high, cars. But in cars, we have very high taxes. But in cars, we do not have domestic production. Israel does not have domestic production. Okay? So there's not a story of protectionism here or whatsoever. In all other industries, we used to have a lot of domestic production, and this policy clearly is telling the market, okay, you should go for your comparative advantage. And since I do not have too much time, I'm not showing you the statistics of the exports in Israel, but you will not be surprised if I tell you that from a number like 50% in the beginning of the 90s, it became 75, 78, even close to 80%. If I look at medium high-tech and high-tech industries altogether, which means that the reaction of the market was going to the comparative advantage, which in Israel, those are high-tech industries. And when I say high-tech industries, just to mention one of the products, I would say, for example, electrical devices, electronic devices, optical devices, medical equipment, and so on and so forth. The startups, which are very famous here in Israel, but those are classified as services. So this is where the market went, and when the market went there, it became a basket with some eggs that are all concentrated in the same baskets, and those baskets are related to the high tech. And the diversification is not very high, and that means that people that work at the high tech, they enjoy from the growth process, and they earn a lot of money, and they lead the economy, and this is why I was telling you before that those sectors that are outside, the huge challenge is to get them into this basket with small eggs. And the numbers that are very impressive are the numbers related to the government. So let me start with the position, Israel's position by the end of the 80s. We were the highest country in terms of expenditure, close to 70% of GDP, with a huge expenditure related to defense. 30% out of it, 30% of GDP was related to defense. And as you see, when defense expenditure started to be reduced everywhere, not only in Israel, also in Arab countries, and then we had a reduction of defense, and as progress, already in 2008, already we were lower than the OECD. The numbers today are even lower compared to the average of the OECD. So you see here the updated numbers. We are even lower than 40%. And this is very low in OECD terms, as you will see afterwards when I compare some specific parts of government expenditure. As I mentioned before, the main reduction is related to defense. You see here the reduction of defense, a huge reduction, and you don't see too much change in what I call here public goods, in government services. Government services, there is not too much reduction. And if you look at education and health, you won't see also too much reduction in terms of GDP. But the subject is much more complicated because, as I mentioned before, we have a young population. So when you look at education, it's not enough to look at percent of GDP. You have to look at the expenditure per student. And this is a variable that I like a lot, and it's not easy to find it. You have to do research in order to find it. The average statutory tax rate. What you see here is I take all the taxes that we have in Israel, and I ponderate them using the weight of each tax item in the revenues. So you see here the income tax, company tax, VAT, all indirect taxation, everywhere you see here. And what you see is that during 15 years, the tax was not changed in Israel. And since 2003, that's why I talk about the last decade, it was abruptly reduced in an unprecedented way in historical terms. And now, in the late years, we saw that that's impossible. So we saw some turnaround. But even today, we continue to see this policy. There was a decision about reducing tax rates last month, which was, I think it was, in my opinion, as a macroeconomist, was not the right one. But that was done 1 month ago, and that policy continues. And in terms of debt, we actually did very good, because you see Israel, rating agencies, they look at debt to know whether you're a good country in terms of macroeconomics. So we look very good in terms of debt, a huge reduction. But one of the reasons we look good is that there was an increase in the other countries. Okay, not because of Israel, but because of the problems that they had during the world crisis. But still, we have a relatively high debt, more than 60%, which is considered relatively high. So this is very nice. It gets us to a relatively nice macroeconomic story, but we have the other side of the coin. And the other side of the coin is poverty and inequality. And as I said before, I can only mention the subjects and not get, those of you that are interested, you can look at the resources and then get and understand it. For example, in unemployment insurance, we had one of the shortest periods and lower percent of wage among OECD countries. Among young couples, there is a very low support to young families compared to OECD countries, which is related to the cut that we had in child allowances. And in child allowances, to say it very clearly, there was a huge cut in 2003 at the universal allowance that positions Israel in one of the lowest places compared to OECD countries. So, and there are many other places that I'm not getting into them, that when you reduce the government, you do it all around, and you will find many places that are very problematic in terms of poverty and coping with inequality. And you see here a more actual comparison of Israel and the OECD. You see Israel with a lower number than the average. I also stressed Turkey for you in order to see both countries. And you see that we are lower than the average. And if you look at the education per student, then Israel has a bad position as well, lower than the average. And this is problematic, although in terms of GDP it was not reduced, but in terms of per student, given that we have a very young population, many students, this is problematic. I mentioned a challenge. The challenge was to take the population that have many children and advance them into high-tech. So if you want to advance them into high-tech, you shall start by primary education. This is the first place. If you don't have them there, you lose them forever. You have your window of opportunity during these 6 years. The one that is not in the wheel, he will not be afterwards. Not in high school, and it will become, each time the challenge will be harder and harder. And we are not showing good statistics in this topic. In health, the story is different, because in health we have a relatively young population, and we have a relatively good position in international comparisons, both in terms of the system and both in terms of the expenditure. But when you look at it per capita, it is not very high. But we have to be careful here, because it should be corrected for the composition of the population. And since we have less elder population compared to other countries, we may look a little bit better. And in terms of inequality, we usually use the Gini index, where again we see Israel in one of the lower places in the same groups of the same countries that I've shown before in terms of poverty. The problem, and this is the main point that I want to stress by the end of my dissertation, is that the problem in Israel is that we went to a market allocation, but when you are a working person, if you do not work at the industries that have high wages, then you become poor, and not necessarily if you have two earners, you go out of poverty. So you see here the poverty according to the number of earners, and you see that when you have two earners, usually the poverty rate is low. But for example, in the Arab sector, it is 29%, even if you have two earners. Why is that? Because the Arab population is working in jobs that are not related to the growing sectors of the economy. So the market allocation is not really taking care of these kind of problems, which is the huge challenge of the Israeli economy. And now it's not only a challenge of poverty, it is also a challenge of growth, because those are the young populations in Israel, and if they do not acquire higher education, and then they will not be able to renew the engine of growth in Israel in the next 40 years. Let me show you also this graph, which shows you the number of poor families with two earners or more. It became 6%. And the interesting thing here, that is rising, all the time rising. What does it mean? It means that the economy is growing, and some people is left aside. And even if you have two earners, they are left aside and they become poor. So the solution, and I'm getting to the end, the solution is to cope with it. And what is the Israeli way to cope with it? Something that is called the Earned Income Tax Credit, something that is done in the US since the 70s. And in Israel it is very relevant, because you want to have incentives for people to work, especially in those two sectors that they have only one earner, usually, the Arab and the ultra-Orthodox. So we give an earned income tax credit that it gets to a maximum of 15% of the wage in Israel. It is substantial for a poor family with two earners. If they have one earner, that's not really important to get them out of poverty. If there are two earners, that helped them. And the participation increased in the last 10 years for both populations, the Arab and the ultra-Orthodox, but that also is also related to a huge cut in child allowances. And this is problematic because the cut in child allowances got them into poverty as well. So now the question is whether they will go the other way around, and this is a process going on with relatively poor results. I mean, we do not see a big change in poverty. We see they are participating more, but we do not see a huge return in terms of poverty. Did the ITC work? The take-up rate climbed. Take-up is the number of individuals that got into the program. So the take-up rate climbed from 45% at the beginning to 62%. That means that 48% of persons are not profiting, the 38% of persons are not profiting the program. It reduced the amount of workers exiting the labor market. That was shown by research. It reduced poverty, but only marginally. And maybe it will work in the future, but that will happen if the subsidy is raised. Because if the subsidy stays 15%, what we see is that it's not really remarkable, and this is maybe one of the main explanations why we have such a low take-up, because people do not find the money so attractive compared to the US, where they had a very long process that started in the 70s, and this number should surprise you to the ones that do not know it, that in the US, the federal maximum amount of the EITC is 45% of the wage, which means that the workers get a check from the government of 45% of their wage, so as to have an incentive to participate in the labor market. The comparable check in Israel may get to 15%, and it's only important if the two earners are there, only both of them are there, you can get to some place that can be considered as normal. But as the numbers prove, not enough. This is not enough. So I think I will start here. I just tried to show you the main problems. And thanks for your attention.